Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the latest of our online panels, delving into some of the amazing findings we've had from Amplified Voices. So we'll be starting in just a couple of minutes. We've got some amazing panelists lined up today, so really excited for you guys. Yeah. So yeah, thank you everyone so much for joining this evening for the latest of our online sessions delving into the stories and histories of youth culture. And this last session is really a bit looking at the different ways in which we can consider and look at youth culture and the heritage of youth culture and kind of expand that concept outwards. When we started this journey of as the Museum of Youth Culture, we are very much looking at post-war youth culture. When the term teenager first came into use in the 1950s, and that development from that word first emerging to being a teenager being seen as kind of a crucial point within everyone's life and everyone's experiences. Now, since we started that journey, we've started going further back. When we talk about the stories that the Museum of Youth Culture wants to tell, we talk about 100 years of youth culture, so from the 1920s to the present day. But actually the experiences of youth culture and being young, they actually go way further back, but they also touch into so many different elements. And while youth culture is its own form of heritage, it's also part of our social history. It touches onto other traditions like folk culture and community histories. But also by looking at youth culture and engaging young people in heritage, we can also really start to break down the idea and the notion of what heritage and social history is and different ways of looking at and experiencing that. So today's lineup of amazing panelists is really all about looking at some of those different aspects and different experiences. So just to introduce, first of all, the four speakers that we have today. First of all, we'll hear from Jamie Abraham Brett. Now, he is the Creative Projects Manager here at the Museum of Youth Culture, but some of you might have heard that he's been working actually on an amazing MA thesis that's been making the case for seeing youth culture and subcultures, and particularly rave culture, as a form of folk culture and folk custom and folk tradition. And actually, taking youth culture and youth culture stories and exploring that in different ways and from different angles, and really seeing the way that youth cultures emerge as this kind of community-driven form of expression that has so many tangents within folk traditions and folk histories that go back to antiquity. After that, we'll be hearing from Dr. Emily Ward. She's currently doing some incredible research looking at the adolescent experience in medieval Europe. So really very firmly saying, actually this experience of being young and being a teenager, we can actually look at different iterations of that, going way further back than this post-war experience and looking all the way back to kind of medieval history. After that, we'll be hearing from Eugene, who's the project manager of We Don't Settle, an incredible organization that's doing a lot of work trying to shift and change the idea around what heritage is and get young people involved in the heritage sector and really help change the narrative and placing the youth voice front and center into how we talk about and see and explore heritage and social history. And last, we'll be hearing from Jafar Ali, who's an artist and anthropologist who's been doing an incredible project called Chicken Shop Stories, where he's been looking at these kind of ubiquitous spaces and delving into how, by looking at these spaces, we can actually explore different youth culture experiences and kind of see how using space we can actually get an understanding of how different people experience growing up and some of the different life stories and life experiences of being young and growing up. So a really exciting panel. Now, the format of this evening is that each of our brilliant panelists will be doing an introduction about their work and kind of their research or their organization. And this will be followed by a bit of a group discussion really around how we can look at youth culture as a form of heritage, but also more generally how we can reapproach the heritage sector and the museum sector and change how we approach narratives within these sectors. So yeah, I'm really excited to bring on, first of all, Jamie Brett. Jamie, if you want to turn your camera back on and pop on up.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, can hear you perfectly.
Perfect.
So yeah, I'll jump in the background and I'll go ahead.
Sure. Okay, so I think we should be able to see that now. Is that all good?
Yeah, perfect. Can see that.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Lisa, for that introduction. Someone that spoken to me on a daily basis over the last sort of year and a half. That this has been an ongoing project. So, yeah, it's always one of those things that's hard to see the wood from the trees. So my name is Jamie Brett. I manage creative projects at the Museum of Youth Culture. One of my focuses has been over the sort of the last 2 years has been thinking about how we can create a new lens for looking at youth culture, perhaps a way that enables us to see youth culture in a light that perhaps is more radical or more future thinking. I think my sharing is saying it's paused there. Is that working for you at all, Lisa? Can you just let me know if that's...
It's currently still on the first slide, youth and folk.
Yeah, it's saying sharing pause, which is strange. Okay, so...
And now it's gone on. I think maybe because you're clicking play, it's going out. So maybe if you share your whole screen and try that again.
Okay, let me just do that 1 second. Okay, is that right? That's it, isn't it?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, perfect. So obviously I've got a short amount of time here. So what I'm going to do is run through youth and folklore and where we seem to be at today, and then also a run through of my recent dissertation, which I've completed as well. So it'd just be a chance to do a bit of an overarching sweep of folklore and youth culture in terms of where we're at in our thinking within the museum. So folklore has been, I think the sort of standard definition for it comes from the Folklore Society. As you can see here, it covers an incredibly wide range of different topics and customs, myths, legends within society. We sort of feel that youth culture should be under this list, but perhaps it fits under different areas within that. So it could be under folk music. We could be looking at folk dance, perhaps rave culture could tie in with that as well. But at the end of the day, where our cultural sort of like divergence comes with, or a crossover goes with folklore and youth culture, is that we're seen as intangible heritage. And folklore in its various ways has been designated as that within UNESCO. However, youth culture unfortunately hasn't. So we have a bigger challenge to reach, but perhaps through things like folklore studies, we can start to look at different ways of analysing our own collections. There's all sorts of connections that you can make, and I think there's only so much usefulness in doing this, but it's worth just to sort of show, first of all, where perhaps those connections can tie in. So that, for example, things like customization of clothing, particularly around a specific event that involves gathering in the public or even dancing. You can see comparisons between leading from the sort of Morris dancers right up to the Pearly Kings and Queens, right up to the rockers within the archive. So things like that can be made sort of quite figuratively. And also the idea of the Night Stalker as well is something that comes up a lot within sort of more modern folklore studies around the idea of being out at night and just the whole perception of being a nighttime inhabitant. Obviously, we had curfew bells and things. We had curfews across most urban areas within medieval times, but in some places going right up to the 20th century. So when we think about images like this, perhaps they tie in quite well with moments within our archive as well. Both of these images are looking at sort of, this is piracy, and then here we're looking at rave culture, and they're always things that are have that sort of connotations of being illicit, perhaps. And the idea of the untamed countryside is something as well that comes up a lot when we talk about youth culture and rave, the way in which people take over the land that was previously common land, but then is often now becomes privatized. But this idea of, the untamed area, and how that ties into these warehouses that were once existing on these sites as well. I think one of the things that I find sort of most powerful about this is the sort of haunted landscape, in terms of the idea that there is a previous history to this land, and we somehow tap into that when we use it for partying. My dissertation in particular looks at a few different features around the way in which the land could perhaps be sort of continuing to carry on the lineage. And it sort of definitely has a connection within rave culture in itself. I think that's the closest connection at the moment, but it's not. It could also be something that we could look at other subcultures with, because in general we say that subcultures involve a certain place to locate people. That could even be an online space, and also a certain style, a certain common knowledge within a community or within a subculture. So it ties in quite well with what folklore and folkloric studies tends to look at. Also, there's things like, youth culture brands at the moment have been looking at folklore. There's nothing sort of like academic tying this together, but the idea that there is something within the collective consciousness at the moment, and for some reason we're finding a lot of brands that work with us or that sort of work in our periphery, looking at the idea of folklore researcher, for example, on a baseball cap. It shows there's something in the air, and perhaps one of the reasons why I wanted to start talking about this was because of a sort of something in the atmosphere that was sort of teasing me into going further. There's more sort of like on the surface. We've got things like TikTok and the idea of cottagecore and people trying to connect back to a sort of more rural existence or a more simple life. I think that's often what folklore does to people, or does for people. And then also looking at rave culture as well, there's been a massive sort of, I guess, shift towards mushroom imagery, things that are mythical, sort of like drawings and things that have connections to folk tale. So again, there's perhaps another tie-in with this is the idea that there's something else going on that we're not that we're sort of tapping into collectively because of the world that we're in at the moment. Perhaps it is to do with the uncertainty of society and politics and the planet, that we're starting to look at a more simpler life and a way of connecting to something that's a little bit perhaps beyond us, but also simpler. So my dissertation, this is the title of it. It's actually just recently been submitted, and it's called Bass Bounds. Sorry, my screen's gone all weird. Anyway, so it's Bass Bounds, diasporic land soundscape in South London's Bermondsey Triangle. So essentially, this dissertation was looking at a way of making the case for 3 venues in South London that I am been connected to for a while. I've been attending as a raver sort of since 2018, using these 3 venues to sort of find a narrative and understanding, a collective, a sort of a common story between them that could be used and applied to other nightlife sort of nightlife spaces. So the Bermondsey Triangle, it involves 3 spaces and it's a triangle that I've sort of made up myself, and obviously we've got this connection to the Bermuda Triangle as well. So just in terms of like the folkloric connection, obviously as soon as you think of that straight away, you're going to think of the Bermuda Triangle, but this sort of term Bermondsey Triangle is something that has been spoken about within the Bermondsey community and within the clubbing community in London. So it wasn't something I made up as a term. It's something that I've started to add some weight to in terms of what it looks like and what perhaps it could actually be. So South London, South Bermondsey, near Millwall Football Stadium, we're sort of in between Depth, the Old Kent Road, and New Cross as well. So it's quite a student/light industrial area. So it's basically got some sort of 1980s housing, and most of it's still used as industry. You can see the 3 venues that we talked about and the way that it brings them all together into one sort of topographic shape that does actually look like a triangle. And even prior to this research, I think no one really thought that it was going to look like a triangle but it does, thankfully. So you can see here context is where it sits within the sort of South London central that sort of topographic landscape. And there's been all sorts of fascinating links that were found in the early days of this research, because we've started to looking at things like what was the area before. There's a boarding school on the site, there was a pub on the site, and there was a lot of records of people walking down these paths, which are essentially paths linking the Surrey Canal with other parts of London. So the first thing to notice is the fact that we are on a canal here. Nowadays, it's all been fully filled in, so it's now a road. But in sort of the end of the 19th century, it became sort of mid-19th century, it was built connecting central London into Surrey. At the time, this would have been Surrey as well. So it's when London was really small, particularly South London. And this view here is actually looking at one of the venues. Well, it would be looking at one of the venues today. The path is still there, but the banks turn into a sort of a dip into a road. And what was really interesting about this is the research took me into a place where I was looking at, first of all, how do we understand what the triangle is? So it required a lot of walking. It required a sort of a method of looking that sort of felt a bit like a psychogeographic way of thinking about a space. So it was just taking a group of people with me from different backgrounds, different parts of my life, or pick different sort of areas of interest, to just walk through it with me, take a notebook and write what you see, and do that at night. And it was really interesting because we sort of used those notebooks to sort of, I guess, find like a general idea of the perception of what the Bermondsey Triangle feels like, but also using walking as a way of marking the map, and in my head knowing what I'm writing about and where the spaces, those clubs that exist, sort of begins and ends. But this factory I found actually really towards the later stage of research is just on the edge of where one of the nightclubs is now, and this used to be a cocoa and tea factory. So it was essentially taking goods from the canal, from sort of the colonies, from the colonial world, and turning it into products. And that was happening right on the triangle itself. And then further up the road, sort of research took me to a point where we found that there was a factory existing that was pressing very early ska and reggae and sort of like early Jamaican folk music, like mento music, and taking those recordings from the canal route, pressing them and distributing them across the UK. So sort of taking on a new type of music and then starting to disseminate that idea, which in turn then creates a whole music scene, a whole sort of subculture within itself. And the thing that was interesting about this is the subcultures and the music that's being played here has a direct lineage to the nightclubs that now exist. So it feels like there's a sort of ecology here of what's going on within the triangle, and that's kind of what was quite fascinating. One of the things that I did interviews with venue owners as well, and one of them said to me that he goes, because there's obviously an element of intellectualizing that you do here, and I think it's important to do that and then perhaps unpick it later on. And I think we're still at the stage where it's still quite intellectual, but we can really simplify this down. And the owner said, I didn't set this club out of my own ideas. It was already written on the land to set up a club. He felt that there was something in the air already, and having run artist studios in the area, there was a need for people to play music in the area. So there's a really sort of strange, sort of like hauntological idea that like the landscape is repeating itself, and we're now hearing the sounds that were perhaps coming down that canal at some point in sort of the early 1950s. So this triangle here is one of my strange creations, and basically it uses a folklorist's idea of what folklore is, and it's called Ben Amos. And he looks at the idea that you have to have an element of communal knowledge that has come through survival, and everyone's kept this knowledge together and they've been speaking to each other and carrying it through generations. And in this case, that could be just the idea of going out. That's something that we have always carried down through generations into generations, the idea of celebrating and raving. And then the idea that there are grassroots spaces that need to be upheld for this. And that's the idea of collective representation, and the idea that people, know that we need to create a space to be able to continue this culture. And then alongside that, there's normally an art or a communal creation. So it's sort of the thought, the knowledge, and the art that basically creates a folklore. And this was making the case that rave culture, particularly in this kind of circumstance, so not necessarily talking about going to like Ministry of Sound or Central London nightclub, we're talking about these spaces that come out of generally low money, generally don't make a lot of money, haven't the whole sort of intention for the space is just to serve a purpose in terms of creating somewhere for people to spend time, which taps into all sorts of folkloric activity that have a folk space that that they run from. And as you can see, this is the center of the triangle, and the club exists down this road in here, in this little industrial estate. And the future of this space is it's unusual, because we're now looking at a point where essentially you could call this a folk club or a folk gathering that's going to be this, which is Transport for London's new plan to build an overground station connecting this new part of Bermondsey. So there's a real sort of, it's a temporality to it. It just feels like this is something that we need to do to all sorts of spaces before they disappear. It's been really interesting, because the idea of taking interviews from something that feels quite liminal and transitory, and then writing it into a document and writing it into a dissertation, it feels like it's, you know, what the Museum of Youth Culture does, which is sort of vernacular histories being, you know, being sort of made permanent. But the idea is that this would be a sort of, I guess, a model or a sort of framework in which you could do further research in other places across the UK, perhaps even across the world, to look at a new type of partying and understand why it exists. But, you know, everything disappears one day. And even like on the left here, the canal itself in the 1970s, before it was being filled, went through a similar transitory period. And now when you look at what the street looks like now compared to this, it still looks, you know, a million times more gentrified. So it's been a really fascinating story, sort of like delving into something that, you know, this is what the club looks like. It's a beautiful space. It has an incredible energy. And it feels like one of those spaces that everyone knows is going to disappear at some point. But when the lights go on, it really is just some concrete in an ex-MOT garage, so a car garage. But somehow it means so much to people. So yeah, so this has been a real case study to be like, how do we make sense of that, and what could that look like? I actually ended up making my own final Bermondsey triangle, which is the fear, sorry, not the fear, but like the sort of the emotions that people feel between different spaces. And during the walk that we did, we found that everybody had the same sort of feeling walking from venue to venue. So yeah, you know, some of the venues have fear and thrill and a sense of unease when walking the route, and then the other roads started to feel, you know, much more welcoming and warming. But I think that's something that's just very much comes to play when you're looking at these spaces that are not designed to be there in some space. They're not sort of, in a way, there's no planning for them, they're completely unplanned. And I think that you end up having a really varied experience in terms of, like, you know, the type of people that come to visit it. The way that people respond to it often depends on their background and their understanding and their enjoyment of certain types of music as well. So there's loads of things that come into play here, but it was just really interesting to visualize what that, you know, could start to look like when we you know, really get it down onto pen and paper, basically. And a few more shots from inside the space as well. This is sort of one of the venues. There are two more, but I think this venue, just for the purpose of this, is the best way of explaining sort of like what and showing what kind of culture we're looking at here when looking at these sort of more liminal nightclub spaces. So just anybody's interested, I have put a bit of a further reading section on here as well. Some fantastic books that actually really helped the early sort of research days of this, and it's something that really definitely sort of inspired the way that this was carried out, and particularly Dance Your Way Home by Emma Warren. Emma has worked with us before with the museum on various events and things like that, but she's an incredible sort of ethnographer in the way that she makes sense of nightclub surroundings. She did one that was about the name of it eludes me, but she made one just before this that was essentially it's called Tuning Into Total Refreshment Centre, and it's about a club called Total Refreshment Centre, which unusually has very similar backgrounds to MOT and the Triangle, and perhaps not unusually, and perhaps that might be why this is a good sort of case study that could apply to lots of different venues in itself. But yeah, I think I've just gone on to good timing at this point. I think that's me done. If anyone's got any questions, do fire over.
If you want to stop sharing your screen, Jamie.
Yes. There we go.
I guess, can I have an initial chat? You know, you looked at this idea of rave culture and more generally, I guess, subculture as folklore through a really specific, almost like a micro lens.
Totally, yeah.
What was kind of your conclusion at the end of it? Like, where did you get to when you got to the end of your research, or your thought process when you got to the end of your research?
Yeah, I think all it made me realize was, because I think that's the thing when you're doing research like this, you don't want to necessarily create answers to your questions, which I think you do a lot in this stage. You kind of go, you try, it's really, you know, it's really sort of tempting to just sort of find answers that back up what you're saying and sort of preach to the choir. But one of the things that I just felt was most profound about it was finding links to things that I wanted to find in an ideal world, but found them anyway. And I was kind of like, then this must be the same for other places as well, and particularly those factories, and the way that they've been, you know, bringing in sounds that are from, you know, bringing sounds and cultures from a colonial world, and now electronic music does that every day. It was just really interesting to connect that. So I think that was interesting, but I think the main takeaway from it was more research needed.
In your research, and when I guess you've spoken about this idea of rave as folklore, what has been the general response from people? Do people get it, or are people a bit like, I can't really see that link?
And do you know what? That was one of the biggest challenges for this, because people would either approach it really trying to do your work for you and then going, oh yeah, so I saw, you know, someone Morris dancing it once in a rave, and it's like, that's interesting, but it's actually like not helping the question, because we're trying to make it its own type of folklore. We're not trying to find the old bits of folklore, although, like I did in the early start of the presentation, it's good to just somehow see that there are some really obvious and easy sort of grab and go links, which helps me get the head around it. But I think in general, it was difficult. I wish that I wouldn't approach this as a way of saying it's folklore to people. It would have been easier if I now said, oh, I'm doing a study about clubbing, can I speak to you? And I think I probably would do that in future. But the problem is, you have to ethics form, you know, everyone has to sign the form, and it says what course you're studying. So that's a bit of a problem. But I think folklore in itself, it has academically, it has baggage, and there's essays and essays and so much sort of self-flagellation going on in terms of like the you know, the area of study in itself. But it's because it got dropped out of study in England, because it became, you know, anthropology and sociology filled in a gap, and now folklore is coming back to fill in those, the more intangible side of it, I guess. And do you think, you know, I guess you say, you know, you don't want to answer your own question, but do you think that when you particularly look at subcultural movements, there are those, I guess, those really strong links to folklore, and do you think there is a specific case to be made that the way that youth culture evolves feels very, I guess, in tune or in keeping with how folk traditions evolve in, I guess, a modern societal context? Yeah, I think that's hopefully what this is trying to make the case for. So, as well as further research, it's just the case that actually this is a school of thought that should be applied to youth culture and subculture in general, particularly around the way that it is just a form of, like, often unplanned gatherings, or organized but unplanned, if that makes sense, where it will be a series of spaces, items of clothing, records that become really important to a select group of people. And that's what folklore is. But then there's a problem with folklore in the fact that there's a snobbishness to it as well. And this has been written about loads too, but there's the idea of like the folk club, or the 1970s idea of like getting dressed up in an evening and spending the whole time in a church-like environment, seeing people do folkloric performances that are like, you know, of old England. And that doesn't help either. Although that's important to some contexts, it's one of those things that would stop. If that was the way we looked at folklore, I wouldn't be talking. It's because you know, that's what folklore is now pushing against as an area of study. And it's worth mentioning as well that there's Celtic studies, you know, in Ireland and Wales and Scotland universities, but we don't have that. We don't have an English studies. Well, we do, but it's about language. So America covers folklore and rave under American studies a lot as well, and they also have folklore. So this is the first university, it's the University of Hertfordshire, that's doing the folklore masters, that's been sort of like exported to the States and then brought back again.
I think it's quite interesting because you say, you know, there's sometimes a snobberish around folklore and what constitutes as folklore, but it's quite interesting because you have those discussions in subcultural circles as well, where people say, well, that's not really what punk was, or, you know, if you were a mod, this was the only way to be a mod. So it's quite fascinating that you have that kind of, I guess, that synergy in some way where you have some of those similar discussions happening.
Totally, it's exactly the same. I'm sure there's people that get dragged along to, you know, a mod gig that they're not really enjoying, but they have to go because they're told that's the real music, and that, you know, you need, you know, there's always the gatekeepers, the cultural gatekeeper, and I think that's what needs to, I guess, be like pushed aside a little bit. Still keep it there, but just push aside and see there is another way of interpreting this as well. Yeah, it's been exciting because I think in terms of the Museum of Youth Culture, it's made me think of different ways that we can do almost like the ethnographic work that we already do, the boots on the ground, the conversations with people, but we don't necessarily have to approach it from a subcultural Bible approach. We can approach it from more about what does the area look like, where are they spending time, what's the history of the space that they're in. It just adds another area, hopefully, anyway.
I think it's quite interesting as well because we've obviously been in contact with the Museum of British Folklore, but they're kind of in a similar page or a similar part of their journey where they've just done their first museum exhibition. You know, they are trying to build a museum similar to us, where they've realized that actually when you look in wider heritage spaces, often these histories are overlooked. And I guess it comes down to those kind of more everyday common stories that aren't being represented or told, or the voices that are not being heard in some way.
Totally.
Okay, cool. Well, I think thank you so much for your time. We'll be having the group discussion at the end, but I'll let you go for now. So super excited to bring on our second speaker after this as well. But yeah, thank you so much, Jamie. So up next, we have got Emily Ward. Emily is a professor, is a doctor and professor who is based at the University of Edinburgh and is currently doing some exciting research into adolescence in medieval Europe. So hi, Emily, how are you?
Hi, Lisa. I'm doing well, thanks. How are you?
I'm really good. Thank you so much. But yeah, really excited. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am going to jump out again and I'll let you introduce your work.
Brilliant. I'm afraid I don't have a fun PowerPoint to share, so I hope everyone, all the listeners, are all right with me just kind of talking. But yeah. Yeah, so thank you for having me on the panel today. Really excited to hear Jamie's talk and looking forward to the other two speakers as well. What I wanted to do really is just sort of talk about three main things today. How I got to working on youth, my current project, which is looking at adolescence and belonging in what I describe as the Central Middle Ages, but that's the period between the 11th and the 13th centuries in sort of northwestern Europe. And then finally, kind of a couple of sort of comments more broadly about perhaps youth culture in the past. So how I got to working on youth, well, my primary sort of research post my PhD, my PhD was on royal childhood and child kingship. So I very much started with an interest in childhood and in particular, elite experiences of childhood in the past. And obviously, elite experiences are a lot easier to find and access in the period that I'm focusing on between the 11th and 13th centuries, because the sources that are created are primarily focusing on sort of aristocratic or upper nobility and royalty. But I was particularly interested in this kind of contradiction between the fact that actually we have quite a lot of instances where it's children who inherit positions at a young age, so they become a lord or a duke or a count and even kings, and then actually what happens there when we have this idea of a child or a young person in a position of political power and authority. These seem kind of contradictory ideas. So that was what my previous research was working on. And how that got me into thinking about youth more specifically was that it came to the point where I realized that actually how we think about political power and agency and authority is becoming a little bit more complex as we get towards that end point of childhood and into youth and adolescence. Particularly the idea that actually it was more problematic almost for a political community when somebody who had been a young ruler, a child, was actually coming to exercise more will and agency over the decisions that were being taken. So it's often associated, adolescence and youth is the time where young rulers start to make more decisions about their own ability to exercise power in their own name. So perhaps by choosing their own peer groups around them, choosing their own counsellors. So this idea that actually adolescence and youth was problematic, perhaps more problematic than childhood within a political context, was something I was interested to think a bit more about. I also then, because I studied a period over sort of 2 centuries between the 11th and 13th century, I was noticing that there were some interesting things happening with sort of ideas of change over time in how age was treated within the sources that I was looking at. And this idea that actually somebody would have stopped being a child at age 14, 15, and very much then almost was accepted within an adult society automatically, even at the very elite levels of society, at sort of age 14, 15 for young boys, perhaps 12, 13 for young girls. But by the 13th century, what's happening to changing political and legal systems is you're getting a period that we might describe now as an extended adolescence, where you're still getting this kind of restriction of entry into some of the markers of adulthood for people all the way through into perhaps early 20s or even into mid 20s. And that's not something that you just see at the elite end of society. That's also something that you see with the increasing reliance on, perhaps in towns, growth of towns, increasing reliance on things like apprenticeship contracts as well. So for working adolescents as well, this idea that you're still in some form of protected space in one sense, but also very much a place where you yourself are not actually deemed by the society in which you're a part of as having full adult rights. So that just got me really thinking about what's the impact of that. And this idea of this period between about age 14, 15 and sort of early to mid 20s hasn't really been studied specifically for the Middle Ages, and particularly for the period that I focus on. So that led me to think about this current project. So my current project is Adolescence and Belonging in medieval Europe, circa 1000 to circa 1300. And what I'm interested in doing there is thinking about, well, what does it mean for young people to be a part of a society in which they're allowed to do certain things and they're not allowed to do other things, but actually where those are fluid across ideas of status, across gender, across different environments, rural, urban. So I'm really interested in ideas of belonging and what it means to be part of society. But the way in which I'm kind of exploring that is through social relationships and bonds. So thinking about families, peer groups, working environments, living environments. And the years that I focus on in particular are ones which have been associated very much with changing interactions with family and who you identify with and associate with young people making decisions about who they spend their time with. Some of that is active choice. Some of that is perhaps less active in the sense of parental decision making, but then it becomes something that the adolescent themselves has to then adjust to as well. Now, I'm saying the word adolescent there and adolescence, but that might be sort of making people here think, oh, but there wasn't adolescence in the past. And I want to make it very clear that I'm not talking about what we might conceive of, particularly in a sort of Western society, as modern adolescence. I mean, I don't think it's perhaps sort of controversial to state in this environment that there isn't one concept of adolescence, and that is socially and culturally constructed. But what perhaps might be of interest to people who work on later periods or whose perhaps interest in youth is far more dominated by the modern world, is that actually this idea that there was an earlier stage in which people were still within this period of growth and change does have very old roots. The context and culture that I look at is very much a Latinate culture, medieval Latin, and medieval vernaculars like Old French and Old English coming into use over this period in written texts as well. And those words, so Latin does actually have a concept called adolescentia, which is where our word adolescence comes from. Now, from the 1960s onwards, or there was quite a prominent turn towards thinking about the idea that adolescence was a concept that didn't exist in the Middle Ages. There's quite a influential work that still is cited today by a French scholar called Philippe Ariès, published in the 1960s, in which he argued that adolescence didn't exist, and neither did the concept of childhood in the Middle Ages. I want to quite quickly dispel that and say there's been a lot of research since then, both on childhood primarily, but also on this kind of period of early youth and adolescence as well, to dispel that. This may not be a period that's definitely the same for everyone. In fact, it's definitely not. But what it is a period where it is seen as something distinctive to go through, living through those experiences as a young person. And from the sort of 1990s, 2000s, there's far more active historical interest in trying to understand what it means to be a young person in the past, sort of obviously inspired by what's going on in the modern world as well. So as I said, my project looks at social relationships and bonds. I'm really interested in how young people place themselves within communities, how they made connections with people, whether that's hierarchical connections. So they might, as a young person, you would be leaving your family home, perhaps, and joining a different working or living environment. So for some young elite men, and I do largely focus on young men in particular, young men that might have been taking a position in service to a lord, first perhaps starting as a young servant, but then perhaps sort of entering a military environment as well. And that would have meant changing interactions, trying to navigate those hierarchical relationships, but also trying to place yourself within a new community of friends and peers and enemies even. That's also a time that's seen as associated with educational changes. So for those people who were still perhaps in some form of education, and that is not necessarily exclusively the most elite, but it is usually people from wealthier families who can afford to send their students, their children off as students to the growing schools and universities that are attached to urban centres like Paris, Oxford in particular. But educational opportunities were increasing over the period that I focus on as well, between the 11th and 13th centuries. So you get a change in kind of culture of educating young people as well. And the word itself, adolescere, where we derive this word adolescentia and adolescence from, is associated with ideas of growth and maturity. So it's this idea of kind of increasing towards something, and an increasing command of will and reason. Now, all of that is quite theoretical, and you can find that discussions about this life cycle stage within a lot of texts in the Middle Ages. But what I'm trying to do is kind of put a little bit more of the sort of social experience of that and the social and cultural experience of that around those theoretical ideas. So that means I look at a lot of different sources. A lot of our sources for young people's lives are very much written from an adult perspective. That might be books of conduct, for example, letters, historical and literary works, religious texts, artwork, documents and records, or perhaps even some of the sort of autobiographical, semi-autobiographical passages that we get from people reflecting on their experiences of being a young person a lot later in life. So a lot of these are dominated by adult perspectives, but I think using them in comparison and placing them alongside the passages where we perhaps do get access into a little bit more of what it meant to be a young person in medieval society, kind of allows us to flesh out a bit more of an idea of what young people were doing, how they were thinking, and this idea of youth culture is a really interesting one to me, because we know for a fact that young people had a really important cultural role in the Middle Ages. So one of the interesting things that's been argued about literary texts over this period is that they're starting to pay specifically closer attention by the time we get to the 13th century to young people's experiences, and particularly to the idea that entry into adolescence and then the years of your late teens and into your early 20s were ones where you yourself were navigating these ideas about new communities, about new bonds, about new relationships, and repositioning yourself in society. Now, these literary texts are also ones that are circulating within a noble and courtly aristocratic society. but they pay greater attention to young people. And part of the argument that has been made by literary scholars is that the reason they do that is because young people are a part of that environment, and that these texts themselves are addressing young people by telling stories about young people. So that's a really exciting kind of finding that has already been found, that means that I'm inspired with the historical sources I work on to think a bit more about similar things from the historical perspective. Most of the sources that we can kind of access young people's experiences through, and particularly ideas of culture, are ones which are critical of youth culture. And I think that this is a really interesting thing, because what I don't have is I don't have the first-hand oral experiences of young people at that moment of going through what they're experiencing or what they're doing. What we have is the criticism of them. And it's interesting when texts do lump young people together, either in this more broad idea of youth, or more specifically, they might mention people at an earlier stage or at a later stage. But the things that they target in these critical texts are very much things that we would now think of as culture. So dress, leisure activities, ideas around, interesting sort of link here with the rave culture, ideas around dancing. So there's a 12th century hagiographical text, A Saint's Life, that talks about the saint making themselves very different as a young woman from their peers at the age of sort of 12, 13, because they didn't want to go to the village fete and dance with the other young girls and boys of their own age. So this idea that there are experiences that are perhaps shared, particularly in that localized context, but also perhaps across a broader scale as well, and that these are recognized not just tropes, but actually things that may have actually had a very real experience for young people. And I think there's this kind of contradictory position within, or perhaps a tension, both in scholarship, but also in modern perceptions of young people in the past. And the tension is, A, that there's this idea that youth and adolescence don't exist in the past, but B, there's this idea that everyone grew up very, very, very quickly. And when that means that it doesn't exist, we kind of then assume everything was happening by adults and being done by adults. Now, I sort of want to conclude with this kind of idea about the fact that a real interesting insight for me, I think, into the kind of way in which that's perhaps actually harming or harmful today, and how we represent historical evidence, was when I was teaching earlier this year. I teach a course, a one-semester course at the University of Edinburgh on adolescence in medieval Europe. It's for sort of third-year students, so coming towards the end of their degree, very much trying to get them thinking a bit more about what were young people doing, who were young people, and how were different intersectional factors shaping young people's lives, whether that's gender, whether that's status, whether that's disability, whether that's religion, and trying to get them thinking about some of the modern ideas they might associate with modern youth, but very much realizing that there is a discussion there to be had with youth in the past too. And anyway, so the takeaway from this teaching, and one of the things that I think surprised me, was that their main takeaway from this course was just surprise that there were young people in the past. And I think that actually is problematic. I think what that suggests is that we as academic historians are not really doing a good enough job to show that the people we talk about are people of all ages. And that does actually very much mean specifically that we have young people there who were doing things specifically in peer groups or in family groups or in working environments where their experience of being a young person was a crucial and integral part of that, and was part of how they were perceived by others, but it was also part of how they themselves were able to act and were able to experience medieval society and culture. So yeah, perhaps if I leave that there for now. I'm aware I've kind of forgotten how long I was supposed to be going on for, but Lisa, I can talk a little bit more, or
I think that's perfect, actually. I think that's a really good introduction. And I think the really fascinating thing about just the things that you've touched on, and even what you've ended on, this kind of like note of surprise that there were young people in the past, and this notion that I guess now we have the teenager as a concept, and that's very specific, and therefore this is this new I guess, period in someone's life. But actually, the idea of the teenager comes out of those experiences that we have as we grow up and we start getting more independence and we start entering new spaces, and the emotions and the experiences and the, I guess, the ups and downs that come with that. And it's quite fascinating because it feels like so many of those discussions and even the criticisms of older generations in medieval times very much mirror how we, I guess, see and perceive young people today, and the fact that we have this almost very narrow view of what a young person is and how a young person should be and in what exact structure that sits. That doesn't actually leave much room for nuance, and also makes it difficult to then go and see that experience within the past.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where I'm really excited that we can have these sorts of discussions, getting people together, sort of across different time periods, across different topics and themes, because I think that's the way to hopefully bring that to a wider audience as well. And yeah, I hope that my students now have gone away from their sort of course and actually take that into the next thing that they're doing, which might not be a course on young people, but actually they might be doing a course next on modern Britain or early modern France. And actually, if they can then be thinking in their head, oh, okay, well, if that's true about people who are in their sort of later stages of life, actually, what does it say about people who are younger? Were people who were in their teens and 20s also doing similar things? Were they not? Why not? And starting to think a bit more about age as a category of historical analysis. And yeah, I think that's really important. And I think having these discussions is one way to hopefully do that.
Have you found at all that, as I guess there's more contemporary discussion around this idea of young people in the past, have you found that people are now looking also at, I guess, important historical figures or important historical events and actually trying to reframe those events slightly because they are saying, well, actually that person at that time was a young person and an adolescent, so actually we've been looking at that event through an adult lens and an adult perception. Well, actually there's probably very different emotions going on for that person because of the age that they were at that time that event happened. Is there any of that work happening where people are going back to things and reevaluating them?
Yeah, I think that is starting to happen. I think there's still a lot of work to do, but there's definitely, I've been particularly inspired by the work that's being done by sort of archaeologists at the moment to kind of go back. And there was a large project at Reading under Mary Lewis and a couple of other archaeologists a few years back, starting to think about, well, what did it actually mean for young people's bodies going through various experiences of adolescence and the way in which your body is physically changing, but also then how that we put that alongside sort of other aspects of work and perhaps youth culture, in the sense that particularly within urban environments that often actually did involve a lot of violence for young men in particular. I mean, also for young women who are sometimes on the receiving end of that violence. But yeah, so the archaeologists, I think, in one sense, are a bit further ahead with thinking about that, perhaps. But where it's really interesting for me is that we often, I think, go in with the default that it's an adult doing something. And actually, there are points in the past. So there's a very famous medieval scholar in the sort of 12th century called Peter Abelard, and he's very famous. And what's interesting about this person is he's usually been studied from the idea of the works that he was writing later in his life. But the point that he goes off to first start trying to found a school of his own, he's only really probably in his early 20s. So his own experiences and how he himself enters his experience of being a teacher is all founded on the fact that he's actually himself at a very early stage of his life and trying to navigate. And he actually describes his age as a factor that's used against him at that point by the other people around him. So I think even some of the sort of most prominent names within the Middle Ages, so thinking, well, actually, what does it mean for people to be doing this at age 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, I think is really important. Yeah. And I think the work that's been done particularly by people working on adolescent brain in particular, and how the brain changes during that period. Some of that has been quite influential in getting people to think a little bit more about perhaps not the biological consistency, but definitely the idea that this is a point where your body and brain are going through a lot of changes. Yeah,
there's definitely a lot of interesting research around that, and I think that point you make as well about this person who's quite young starting a school and how that's perceived, but also how that story is told, I think is quite interesting, because we see it a lot with how youth culture is told today, even with very recent youth cultures, that often the youth element is stripped away, and we talk about these people and their achievements as adult, when actually a lot of the time they were teenagers, and then you lose that youth voice quite quickly and then can't really find it. So that's actually really interesting to hear that that's also happening now.
It's a really interesting, there's a couple of references that I've sort of found and been thinking about a bit more, but there's an idea in the Middle Ages that you write certain categories of work at certain points in your life. So the writing of history, for example, is something you do later in life because you're more mature but things like writing poetry is actually seen as something for a youth to do. And it's almost then written about more dismissively because it's what you have to do first before you get on to writing the serious stuff. And it also means that we actually have less of those earlier works for some people who then carry on writing for another 40 years. And we judge them through what they wrote in their 40s, 50s, but actually they themselves talk sometimes quite fondly about, and I'm thinking in particular here a historian called Henry of Huntingdon, who writes quite fondly about the fact that he wrote poetry with a friend, and actually that seems to have been at the point that he was probably late teens, early 20s. Annoyingly, we don't have that surviving, but yeah, I think, that idea that we lose the youth culture, but actually that doesn't mean we need to necessarily lose the voices of youth if we can kind of try and think about this perhaps in a bit of a more holistic way.
Well, thank you so much for sharing some of your research with us. Like I said, I think it's super interesting because so much of what you're saying and what historians are doing now, reflecting on the past, is what we're saying today as well about how we talk about and reflect youth culture. But yeah, if you want to pop out again and turn your video off, but yeah, thank you so much for sharing. I'm super excited to introduce our next speaker. Eugene Hilton works with We Don't Settle, which is an incredible organization based in Birmingham. We've worked with We Don't Settle this past year as part of this project, but they do incredible work kind of reframing heritage and looking at actually how we approach the heritage sector, and I guess the stories and the histories that we have within the heritage sector, but particularly by bringing in young people and giving them an active voice in the sector. So yeah, thank you so much for joining, Eugene.
No worries. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Lisa, for inviting me to speak. And I just want to say thank you to the previous two panelists for speaking. It was really interesting, and I learned quite a lot about youth culture. So thank you for those wonderful presentations. Mine's going to be a little bit different in that I am pretty much talking about our organization, but in terms of the agenda, I'll talk a little bit about our history. I'll talk a little bit about some of our projects, not all, because we have quite a few. And then I'll talk a little bit about where we're at now and kind of where we're kind of going. But yeah, am I able to share my screen, Lisa?
Yeah, and I'll go in the background as well. So you should just be able to share.
Okay, then. Cool. Can everybody see my screen?
Yeah, perfect. Can see that.
Wonderful. Sorry, I'm just starting the slideshow. Cool. Hopefully it won't block anything off. Sorry, just loading. So yeah, as Lisa mentioned, I work at We Don't Settle. I am the community and the content manager for the organization. But yeah, so I mean, essentially, one of our taglines is we cultivate creativity, embrace cultures, and we live and breathe heritage. So a large, where we kind of focus is the art, culture, and heritage sector. That's our predominant sector in which we engage young people. And we amplify unheard voices and platform untold stories, as mentioned, through the art, culture, and heritage. So who we are. So we are a not-for-profit organization, and we are committed to nurturing and empowering communities of young people who are minoritized by society, systems, and structures. Again, even the way we put that phrase, very, very carefully thought of, in that they are not minorities; they have been minoritized, something that has been done to them as opposed to what they are. Is very powerful. So we thought very long and hard about that phrase and what it means to people we're engaging with. And our work revolves around giving young people the platform to tell their stories, to tell their stories through events and creative commissions, providing spaces for skills development through workshops and master classes, and supporting their social action projects by funding their ideas. And obviously all those reasons are why young people engage with us. But what's not often talked about is that sometimes it is as simple as just meeting like-minded young people, which I was actually a young person on one of the projects before I got employed by We Don't Settle, then Don't Settle, which I'll speak a bit on. And my reason was pretty much I had moved from Botswana to England. And I just wanted to meet like-minded young people, having not knowing anyone in the city. I just wanted to meet young people that, I could have rapport with, that kind of had the same values as me. So that was that space, and I think is a reason for many other young people to kind of engage with what we do. So a little bit about our history and where we come from. So we are actually a legacy of an organization called Beat Freaks. Particularly the art side of Beat Freaks, simply called Beat Freaks Arts, and the Don't Settle program, which I spoke about in the previous slide briefly. So initially, before we were a not-for-profit organization, we were a project, a National Lottery Heritage funded project, and we were under the Beat Freaks organization, particularly the Beat Freaks Arts segment, but we decided to kind of split in 2021, and we are now our very own organization. And one little formula I use to kind of, because it can be quite complicated to describe how we've kind of become this organization, I usually use the formula Beat Freaks Arts Don't Settle equals We Don't Settle. And yeah, Don't Settle basically had worked with young people in the Midlands to challenge the heritage and cultural sector to represent a more equitable shared future by reconsidering how it talks about, preserves and promotes the past. And Beat Freaks Arts was aimed at pioneering art activism and existing to give young people space, mentally, physically, and digitally, to tell the stories about themselves, their communities, and what they care about in the world. And we launched in April 2022 as an independent organization. So what drives us? Our vision is young people, again, this phrase, young people who are minoritized by society, systems, and structures, feel empowered and encouraged not to settle for the status quo. And our mission is to amplify unheard voices and platform untold stories through art, culture, and heritage. We value culture and storytelling, so this is essentially our foundation. We harness the power of art and creativity to celebrate communities. We create opportunities and platforms for young people to tell their stories to the people who need to hear them. And I'll be speaking a little bit about some of our strands, projects or events that we deliver. So another pillar that we value is we create safe and inclusive spaces where young people feel comfortable expressing themselves. We use our leverage and influence to give young people a seat at decision-making tables. And then the last kind of pillar is being responsive and intentional. We listen and we echo. We are alert and tailor our programs to young people's responses to world events. We consult with young people to ensure that our work and approach are authentic. We have within our organization what we call YSC. We love our abbreviation that We Don't Settle, but pretty much what that means is the Youth Steering Committee. So we consult with them about almost everything we do to ensure that we are having, that kind of youth voice behind what we do, and we're doing what young people actually want or need an organization like us to deliver. I still consider myself a young person myself, but it's always good to have like a diverse and varied insights when doing the work we do. But yeah, so our programs, as I said, because we were initially a legacy of Beat Freaks, which was really art focused, art activism focused, we kind of took all the art side, all the art related kind of events and strands, and that being Poetry Jam, as you can see in the slideshow, which is essentially a monthly open mic platform for stories, poems, raps, monologues, rants, and debates. And it's a place where the topic can go from love to comedy to grief in a heartbeat. So it's just this open mic space essentially, and we run it every first Thursday of the month, and that's been consistent for I think 11 years at this point. I think we're due for our 11th birthday next year, February. So that's one of the spaces we kind of took on. And then we have fuel funding as well. So it's essentially a pot of money that young people in the We Don't Settle community, age 18 to 30, can use to react to social issues that are important to them. So it's essentially a small grant of money, but the whole premise of it is that it's super quick, super easy for young people to kind of access that funding, and that our application is pretty straightforward in that we try to respond within 2 days. We have a group of young panelists we engage with to review the application. So it's really catered for young people in that sense. And then we have our masterclasses. Again, that was something taken in from Beat Freaks, and that's they're not as consistent in the same way Poetry Jam is, but they're essentially bespoke creative workshops that offer insight, development, and connection, with them being led by key experts in the relevant field. And then we have Don't Settle program, or I should rather say programs, as there are several strands, even under the Don't Settle project, that are now as part of We Don't Settle. But essentially, Don't Settle, that was the project, empowers young people of color from Birmingham and the Black Country to change the voice of heritage through the arts, research, and governance. So some of our strands that I'll speak about that were specifically with the Don't Settle project, and these were all heritage and culture based. We had an activator or / curator program, and I'll be speaking about some of the projects we delivered as part of that strand. We have a Lunar Campfire program. That's the program I initially got started in before I got employed by We Don't Settle, and that essentially, again, I'll speak a little bit about that, but essentially that is a conversational space made by young people of color for young people of color about topics relevant to them. It can go. We've delivered such events as with quite catchy taglines or phrase or titles, such as "If I'm not white, what do you call me?" I've got a job interview, better put my white voice on, which you can imagine I'm talking about relevant topics that a lot of young people of color want to be talking about. And it's just that kind of safe, non-judgmental space to do that. And then we've had our research strand, which the outcome of which was a book light created by 3 wonderful young women of color. And it was essentially, the whole premise of that was a non-traditional guide on where to start with decolonizing a heritage space or organization. And again, I'll speak a little bit about that. I know I don't have too much time. So some of the work we are proud of, one of which I personally is one of my favorites, is We Are Birmingham. So the We Are Birmingham program was created by Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery in partnership with We Don't Settle, obviously, to redisplay the museum's iconic round room. A group of 6 young women of color worked together to define what it means to be from Birmingham and portray this in the artwork. This was I think it was a really big project in the sense that it's quite a famous room, and don't quote me on this, but I believe it hasn't been changed in over 100 years. And then you had these 6 young women of color come in and, kind of consult and advise on what kind of work they want to be seen, essentially curating the space, and it's closed at the moment, unfortunately. Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery. But when this was launched, it was absolutely amazing and powerful and quite symbolic in what it meant for the community. As many people know how what a melting pot Birmingham is. Poetry Jam, but this Poetry Jam was particular as part of the Birmingham 2022 festival, and was delivered at Victoria Square in partnership with B Music, and it was just a space to showcase the amazing talent from some of the people in our Poetry Jam community. And then we have My Voice, My Path. So this was in collaboration with Roundhouse Birmingham and the Black Heritage Walks Network, and basically we're working to develop a new audio tour alongside 5 incredible, passionate and talented Birmingham, West Midlands-based young people of color. And the aim of the project was to support these, and we refer to them as activators as opposed to curators, as mentioned in the We Are Birmingham project, in researching and producing a Black history audio tour in and around the area of Ladywood. And then I talked briefly about fuel, so I won't elaborate on that, but again, it's just a pot of money. As I mentioned, for the We Don't Settle community age 18 to 30, and it's the kind of projects we take on are reacting to social issues that the individual applicant that they feel is important to them. So that's a bit about some of our projects we're proud of. I am also personally proud of the work we did with Museum of Youth Culture, but I guess I won't say too much yet because that's not live yet. But again, that's also another favorite of mine, just to mention. And here are a couple of photos. This is from the We Are Birmingham project, as mentioned, and those are 3 of the young women that worked on this project, and you can see some of the displays. You can even see the difference in the round room before with the red paint in this image here, as compared to now with the, I believe that's beige, or some shade of beige. And you can see the different artwork now kind of reflecting that Birmingham cultural heritage. This is like just a few photos from My Voice, My Path. Just there's a picture of our young people. That was from the launch event as well, where we had, and I apologize if I am wrong, I believe they were called the Note Benders. But yeah, we had a local band kind of performing at the launch event for that. And you can also see an image of the route in which they worked on in the Ladywood area of Birmingham City. So I spoke about lunar campfires. I spoke briefly about some of our projects. You can see a bit more of the different lunar campfires we've delivered and some photos there. It is the term lunar campfires kind of stems from the idea of a campfire setup, in that it's very intimate. Everyone's kind of seated in a circle, and yeah, there's a fire in the middle. So I mean, usually the fire is metaphorical as opposed to literal, but it kind of stems from that idea, and the lunar side of that stems from the idea of the Society, which was a group of white British straight men kind of gathering every 2 weeks in the late 1800s, I believe, to talk about issues of the country, whether that be politics or science. And this group was made up of Matthew Bolton, Charles Darwin, and a few other names, to say the least. We wanted to essentially flip that on its head and kind of how can we reframe that to be for young people, to serve young people, particularly young people minoritized by society systems and structures. So that's where that kind of idea stems from, and these are all the different titles that I won't kind of go into detail on, but yeah. And then Decolonization-ish, as mentioned, it's a practical guide shaped by reports on the Don't Settle programs and written by the young people on our research program, Tara, Hannah, Laura, and Ida. And Decolonization-ish is a resource that heritage organization can utilize to contribute to the process of dismantling colonial structures within heritage spaces. The term decolonization-ish is used because we find the term decolonization too limiting. It assumes that there is an endpoint where we can eliminate the effects of colonialism from our heritage sector, which just isn't the case. The issue is more complex and nuanced than you can imagine. And this booklight is merely just one of many beginnings aiming to begin the work, even though there isn't any obvious endpoint. The information in the booklight will take you step by step through good practices, bad times, and what some young people of color would want to see in times to come. And then there's just a couple of testimonials. But I believe that does conclude my presentation today. Thank you all for having me. And yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions anyone may have. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Eugene. I mean, I think that the work that We Don't Settle do is so incredibly important in terms of the work of expanding out what the heritage sector is. And you know, I guess in the context of some of the other speakers we've had who are doing research around reframing youth culture and reframing heritage, on your side, it's actually reframing the institutions themselves and the work that they're doing, actually going to them, well, is this relevant, what you're showing or how you frame history, is this relevant to the society and the context that we live in? And I think that's so important.
Yeah.
But I guess the question I wanted to ask initially is, you know, when, you know, the young people that you work with, or when you first work with them, how do many of those young people, particularly young people of color, view the heritage sector or the institutions around them? You know, for example, those young women, when they first walked into the original round room, what is kind of that, I guess, overarching response or feeling, or some of the things people feed back?
I mean, it is usually good in that, like, you know, especially with a, you know, big institution like BMAG, and a very famous one at that, like, you know, having to have a space that actually reflects the Birmingham community is really powerful. But beyond the impact of the projects themselves, I think the young people, because as I mentioned in the earlier slides, like, it obviously is about making an impact in the heritage sector in general, but part of our other goal is to also develop young people and kind of nurture that, because we feel that they are already empowered. It's just about nurturing that and you know, bringing them up and kind of showing them that they can kind of do it. And I think what we find is it's not that every young person we engage with wants to work in the heritage sector. Sometimes it's just about gaining applicable skills through our programs, which happen to be based in the heritage sector. And then they apply that. But what they often find is that, yeah, they often learn a lot from the experience, or learn more about heritage in a way that they never thought to engage with before, if that makes sense. I think maybe the reason they wouldn't have engaged in heritage spaces is because they didn't feel that they were reflected in those spaces to some degree. But I think more than anything, it's absolutely wonderful to see their development and to see where they kind of end up as a result, or as contribution from us, like in where they end up. That makes sense. I think is really enlightening, for me anyway.
I think that's really interesting, because I think we forget that actually, particularly museum spaces as heritage spaces, are actually these kind of like free public spaces that are for the community, that are for people, and that are places to go, and that in that way they have a duty to really think about what they show and how they reflect the society that they are based within. And I think that
exactly,
the heritage sector and the museum sector gets forgotten about sometimes, and it just becomes about these kind of, I guess, histories and these artworks, where actually they're very much contemporary spaces in many ways.
Yeah, no, exactly. And even if you think of the kind of, you know, the literal barriers, like obviously, like, it's a big, you know, cold building. Maybe some of the plaques that are, showcasing the artwork are using fancy or, you know, complicated jargon, you know, or you might have a security guard following you around because you're making noise or you're posting videos. It's just not a space that I think a lot of young people feel welcomed in. So I think changing that would make a big impact and benefit the kind of the arts, culture, and heritage sector. Obviously the heritage sector, I think more in that case, but yeah, I think even how these spaces are and how some of these works are curated can be unwelcoming to young people in general. So I think kind of changing what that means and how a museum can better cater to young people is really important. Yeah.
I guess thinking about a project like the Round Room and a changeover, what kind of, did you have any feedback after that in terms of, I guess, maybe what the museum said about the responses they had from people, or how people interacted with that room differently with this kind of much more modern community-based narrative around what Birmingham is?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, from what I hear from with our partners at BMAG, it was quite a range of different opinions and insights. A lot were very positive in that people were very happy to see the artworks, and to see themselves reflected in the artworks displayed as well. But you did have some people kind of, speaking back to, oh, I miss this, like, oh, I grew up with this. Like, I mean, if you think about it, like the museum is, city center, right in the middle of the city center. It serves like so many different people in and around Birmingham and the Black Country. And a lot of people, I think, have a history with the museum, and kind of, because it makes sense that would be some of the responses in that sense. But I have a philosophy of change is always inevitable. It's going to happen whether you like it or not. And I think there is a conversation around ensuring that, we're not just making change without honoring kind of like previous work. But I think we also have to kind of move forward and start catering to different audiences. And I think it's going to be a bit of balancing act in that case, in finding a way that kind of serves everyone. So it was arranged, but we had a lot of positive feedback in terms of just how people felt and some of the artwork expressed. And I think people were just excited for what's to come for the future. And it was you can imagine, it was such a drastic change from the work that was initially displayed before that. I think it was quite jarring for people as well. So yeah, but you can't have change without a bit of toughness, if that makes sense, or resistance, let me say. Not resistance per se, but yeah, it's quite a difficult thing to do, but it has to be done, and I'm happy with how it's going so far.
Oh, amazing. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And I think that's a really important point. If you want to jump out again and turn off your video and go on mute, and I'm excited to then welcome our final guest. But yeah, thank you so much for sharing about We Don't Settle. Really appreciate that.
No problem. Thanks a lot, Lisa.
So for our final speaker today, we've got the wonderful Jafar Ali. And we actually first came across his work at the Migration Museum, which is based in Lewisham. It's another emerging museum that is telling stories that are often missing from, I guess, mainstream institutions. And Jafar is an artist and anthropologist who did an incredible, is doing an incredible project in South London, an anthropological study in many ways, using the chicken shop and the space of the chicken shop that's so ubiquitous, across South London, I guess London more generally, and the UK, and exploring some of the stories within these spaces and the way that people interact with these spaces, how, the experiences, I guess, they have within those spaces as well, and how by looking at this kind of quite microcosm, you can actually get a much wider range and view about society and community and the different experiences we have in our life. So yeah, very excited to welcome Jafar. If you want to pop on your video and come in.
Hi, are you able to hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Oh, cool.
I'll jump in the background and I'll let you introduce your project.
Sweet. Yeah, my name is Jafar Ali, artist based in Lewisham. Currently navigating, painting and academic research. It's a funny little trip, that is, but we're navigating it, and that's beautiful in itself. The project was at the Migration Museum. It was kind of like it's an ongoing project from, started off as a dissertation piece, and then that kind of grew into kind of like a project during my masters, and yeah, still ongoing. I'm currently trying to like merge it with my painting because there's a lot of potential there. But the project, like the main I guess the abstract is that I'm trying to kind of subvert or re-narrate the narrative that the chicken shop kind of has in mainstream public. Because obviously growing up myself and the people around me, the narrative is you kind of already just, you're born with the narrative that the chicken shop is a safe space for you and your friends and your family. But obviously when you actually go online and you do a little bit of research, I guess the public doesn't see it as that. They see it as a space that kind of nurtures a negative space. So I thought, you know what, I have a completely different experience, a completely different lived experience from what's being told. And this project is, there to kind of re-narrate that. And also kind of using the chicken shop as this like small, this small space, this small kind of, a small start to talk about larger issues. I say small, but it's not. It plays a huge part in many people's lives, or a small part. But like, this small space can talk. You can like, if you're English, Jaffa, yes, this small space can actually kind of like talk about these huge, large, intersectional, topical issues like race, gender, class, and many other things. But yeah, I find that beautiful that you could actually take this small thing and kind of like blow it up into something huge, because I guess that's what anthropology is all about. But yeah, so how I've been doing it, the kind of methodology behind it, the methodology that I've kind of like liked at the moment is kind of like giving a platform for people's voices, kind of, so they can talk about their lived experiences. Because I feel like actually kind of going to these individuals, letting them speak about their lived experiences about the chicken shop kind of helps decentralize and kind of like, decolonize that whole kind of knowledge production that the mainstream media is kind of producing. So that's kind of, this whole project is kind of working to produce a parallel form of knowledge production, or, separate from mainstream, But that's the abstract. But yeah, it's still ongoing. It's at the Migration Museum at the moment, and I'm hoping to take it to other places as well. And I'm trying to merge it with some paintings so it can go into other different spaces. And I kind of want to see how it kind of like operates within these different spaces as well. But yeah, overall, it's an archiving project and it's ongoing. And I hope you guys can also kind of add your own lived experiences to the pile of research. But yeah, that's me.
Amazing. Thank you for introducing that. Could you share, I guess, maybe some of the favorite stories that you've heard so far, or things that have really stuck with you when you've been, I guess, sitting down with people in the chicken shop within that
yeah
I guess share stories?
I'll already share them now because I feel like I should have actually prepared like but there's two stories that stood out to me, mainly because of like how true to life they can be. There's my favorite one so the first one is about a friend that commutes to work, and they're moving to a different area, but actually going out of their way to go to a specific chicken shop just so they can, have that kind of moment of nostalgia sometimes, and also just to feel kind of normal, seeing that they just moved to a different area, but that going from that's one of my favorite stories. But within that conversation, you just a lot can be picked out. And the second favorite one that I had was a love story, and how a space kind of nurtured a beautiful relationship. So it wasn't the major reason why they fell in love, but it's a big reason also in their love story. But yeah, these stories can seem completely kind of like mundane and trivial, I guess, to like larger kind of academic kind of research, but these stories are also very important in kind of, in the narrative. Instead of hearing that, oh, chicken and chips is it's bad for your health, but I don't know, the same person would go to, I don't know, Gordon Ramsay's restaurant and buy and have fried chicken as well there. But you know, like it don't make no sense. But hey, yeah, but yeah, those are those are like the two main stories that stick with me. But yeah, they are some of the stories are, you know, available on the website. I've got more stories I haven't actually placed on the website. The website does need updating, but yeah, it's all on the website.
I think it's that really interesting thing that you mentioned, where it's like when you are sitting down and listening to these stories, they tell you so much more about, I guess, community and lived experiences, and the chicken shop is just, in some ways, it's the four walls where so many different types of interactions can happen. And it's interesting because popular culture, and I guess the popular imagination, as you said, the chicken shop has this really specific, I guess, very specific connotations to very different people. But actually, when you go underneath that and you just speak to people, they actually come out with these amazing stories that give you a really nice sense of, as you say, community, falling in love, but also talk to wider issues about race, class, gender. Were you expecting to find those things when you were going out and hearing people speak? Those kind of like topics are always kind of mentioned, or they're there in the stories, even in the love story, even in the commute story, they're always mentioned. It's kind of as if like the storyteller wants you to figure it out, but it's there. It's not hidden, but it's there. It's always there in any conversation. I feel like most conversations we have as well always has like an underlying kind of like narrative. There's always an underlying narrative, and and when hearing these stories, I was like, it's crazy how the chicken shop intersects with so many different, and obviously then speaking to the actual kind of the people that work at the chicken shop as well, they bring a whole different form of like, narratives that as a customer you were completely unaware of. And each individual is gonna bring something to the table that you're unable to see, or and I think I just love I love the whole kind of like you're building a nexus from just this one space, building this, like it's a nexus. It's built. You're building these. It's a huge spider web. English is not Englishing right now. I think it's interesting because that's what anthropology is all about. And I think you did this project as part of your anthropology degree in MA, right?
Yeah, it was part of my BA in anthropology, yeah. And then I continued it on into my MA in art and politics. And yeah, I think when it transitioned into my MA, there was a bit more freedom with how it can be presented, because I think within anthropology, it helped me develop kind of like what kind of methodologies I wanted to use, but it was still kind of limiting in its execution. Even though I did try and break out of that kind of, I tried to break away from using a lot of academic jargon and try to keep it as a smooth read as possible. But then art and politics allowed me to use like different mediums to present my work: audio, visual, and obviously now I want to introduce kind of like fine art into it a little bit. Yeah.
I think that's really interesting, because I think when people think about anthropology and how it's often discussed is, people going out often to far-flung places, sometimes in a very kind of neo-colonial way, to discover new stories and do these big researches. And I think, we forget that you can actually do these projects and find these really interesting stories much closer to home. And because of that, a lot of these stories are missed or not told. Did you face much of that when you decided to focus on your local area and on these kind of, I guess, in some ways, very much everyday spaces that are very commonplace?
Yeah, no, I think my time in anthropology at Goldsmiths was, a lot of us were critiquing kind of going afar. I feel like going afar for us felt like we were trying to, fetishize the exotic. And there was a whole kind of narrative on that as well. It's like, but I go really far when you could do anthropology of the home. And obviously build your own kind of archive, build your own kind of foundation here. And then obviously by doing anthropology at home, then you can actually then find the links to go afar, if that makes sense. Because, and especially we live in London, or living in London is such a well kind of, you know, the whole world is here. So you're eventually gonna go afar. But I think starting on a base felt right. And also, I think it's also kind of just more of like on my own journey of kind of, I think I just wanted to also feel more rooted in the space that I'm in. Just wanted to be more rooted. But that's a whole kind of conversation within just anthropology. I'm assuming in most universities, it's definitely at Goldsmiths, but yeah.
Do you think it's important, and I guess this doesn't just apply to anthropology, but more generally the heritage sector, and I guess even the art sector, in terms of like looking at more local community everyday stories, and actually by looking at these stories it's super expansive. It might feel, when you talk about it, quite localized and limiting, but actually when you look at them, it's incredibly expansive because it touches on so many different areas.
100%. I feel like also as an institution, if you're within a space, I feel like there is a duty as well to look at your local area before you look, over the pond. I don't know. I feel like that's, especially within, especially if there's an art institution within Lewisham or within Lambeth, I feel like they should definitely, it's a duty. I don't know, but that's a personal opinion. I don't know if people will agree with that, but I feel like there's definitely a sense of duty to clean the house first, just prep the foundations, and then from then on you discover how far you can spread your wings, I guess. Yeah.
Done it out. Amazing. Yeah. Well, thanks so much for sharing your project. I mean, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to invite everyone to come back in, and I just wanted to finish off, I guess, this evening, just a couple of general questions, a bit more to kind of, I guess, as a group discussion to share thoughts around. So yeah, if everyone wants to pop back in. Hello, everyone. Because yeah, I guess as a panel, I was really interested in this idea of actually how do we expand out our ideas of what heritage is and what culture is and what youth culture is, and actually, touch on really different areas, because you've all come from very different perspectives in many ways, from like anthropology and art to folklore to, I guess, medieval historian to like the contemporary heritage sector, but actually they all touch on that same strand of actually looking beyond what the set narrative is around many of these issues and around many of these stories, and actually saying, well, actually we need to look a bit further and we need to actually challenge what the dominant narrative is and actually make these links and these connections, because it starts making a lot more sense that way. And I think when we think about the Museum of Youth Culture and why we're trying to do it, I think a lot of it touches on that, and on that idea of, well, actually this is such an obvious part of our history that everyone's experienced, but somehow it's not represented anywhere in terms of the heritage sector. And that seems very abrupt. That seems very, strange in some ways, which is a bit of a rambling opening, but I guess just generally, getting your thoughts around, I think, ways in which, the different sectors that you're in, what you feel needs to change, or actually things that should be happening that you're working on, or changes that you're seeing that you think are really important to kind of make these spaces much more accessible to everyone in the everyday public and young people as well.
I might just add to that, because obviously with me being Lisa's colleague working at the museum, I've got my own bias in terms of what the answer to that question. But I think that one of the things that the reason why we're all talking here is because youth culture has become much more of a broader, and rightfully so, much more of a broader term in terms of the way we look at what young people have been doing. I think prior to even the last 10 years ago, we were still looking at subcultures and looking at those like really sensationalist movements as a way of looking at young people. Everything else, people weren't really that interested. From our perspective anyway, people were just kind of like, oh, it's niche anyway. We were told that running a museum of youth culture or having the idea to do that is really niche, and it's, there's no point doing it. Like, we've had that said to us before. So it's interesting that now I think we require different lenses to look at the overarching view of what young people have done today, yesterday, and throughout history as well. So it kind of feels like we're having to develop our own lenses, and I think it seems like we're all doing that at the moment, I think.
Yeah, really good point, Jamie, and just to kind of add on to what you've got to say is, obviously I don't think it's a simple answer, but maybe a good starting base. On my experience working with We Don't Settle, I think, is we used to love to ask every single young person we work with at some point, what does heritage mean to you? Oops, sorry, my battery's running low. We used to ask them what heritage means to them, and we found that more often than not, we got a different answer, and it's always dependent on who you ask. I think in the UK, there is a very kind of defined definition of what heritage is. We found that sometimes, like, it usually is associated with a tangible building or space or object, or kind of, it's got its own definition. But when I was asked that question, I immediately, my mind went to, when I thought of heritage, I kind of went to traditions, ancestry, and you might get different answer depending on who you ask. And I think it's about looking at what when we're communicating about heritage or getting different communities to engage with heritage, it's like, what message are we putting out in the words we use and the way we use them? Do we need to, do it in a different way? Do we need to redefine the term for this modern multicultural England? Like, I don't know, but I think that might be a good starting base conversation-wise, for me at least, and just a bit of what we've noticed in terms of working with many different people from different backgrounds. But curious to know what other people think.
I think one thing I just wanted to add to that, which I think is really interesting, is that the UNESCO's been putting a lot of time and effort into this idea of intangible cultural heritage. And it's exactly that, this realization that if you just look at the objects and the buildings at face value in their kind of set historical terms, and you don't really delve deeper or look at the cultural areas that underpin it, or the way different people experience those times, then that heritage becomes quite flat. And I think it's really interesting that they're trying to push that idea of intangible cultural heritage as actually being incredibly important and actually really needing protection as well.
I was just also adding on to what you were saying. I guess, are you also saying that it's kind of also like what's the term? A shift in kind of what was considered more powerful, if that makes any sense. So instead of saying buildings, history, tradition, these are certified, verified forms of, information. This is what it is, and then kind of shifting it, going, actually, you can, these intangible, these I guess oral histories are also just as valuable and important as these kind of, like, I guess, archived by the government kind of. Again, sorry guys.
That does make sense.
My English and my
I was just gonna say, say to that, I think that is the idea of like the collective archive that comes through generations of people that often gets spoken about in folklore. Even the archive as being something that everyone's connected to from birth, even, and it just comes through. And sometimes, like I was mentioning before, but the simple things like how we celebrate and how we spend time together, and how that becomes a youth culture moment, often comes from something that is beyond what we can even imagine as like a piece of local history or previous history. And it's interesting because, like, often when we do a heritage lottery application and they're like our biggest funders, we have to sort of, it's like, are you buying a building, or like, are you renovating a building, and like put the cost for like capital work? And we don't have any capital work because we don't have culture in that way. So it's not as if we need to preserve a venue and then like do it up, and then because even that would be the most relevant thing we could do, but it still doesn't quite touch upon the tangibility of youth culture.
Exactly. if I can just sort of add to that, that I work obviously in a period where quite a lot of the culture as a whole is intangible, or what we have left and that we can go on. So I find this just such a really interesting discussion about a very kind of modern urge to kind of protect that intangibility. I think that's just so like vital, really. That kind of what needs to change that you asked, Lisa, and I just thought what Jaffa was saying about the fact that it's about on institutions as well. And I know universities are very aware at the moment that actually it's on us to be having wider discussions, not just looking inwards to the university and research environment. And I think perhaps that's done better through people like sociologists who work much more closely with the communities they're working with. But I think that's on us as academics to be trying to also do that as well. So yeah, I thought just to say, I thought that was a great point about what needs to change from an institutional perspective. That's sort of all I wanted to add from my perspective.
I think that's interesting as well, because I guess in some way it relates as well to the research that you're doing, and the fact that people are kind of like, how youth culture exists in medieval times, or adolescence exists in medieval times. And it's again because we look at these things in quite regimented ways, and almost in some ways, I guess, at face value of like, this is the history, and we forget that it's still people's lives, and people have their everyday stories and their experiences that get lost within that narrative. And I think, that's often, I think when we speak to young people, a criticism of museums is that, where is the relation to them and their lives and their everyday experiences, rather than just these kind of, I guess, historic artifacts. It becomes difficult to make that link to themselves and how they experience their life.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's so interesting, some of the themes that have come up about things around food as a place, and chicken shops as this kind of like location, social space. You see sort of similar threads, like, and the idea of food as an identity or as a part of identity, as clothing, as dress, and the idea of arts. And I just was thinking, Eugene, when you were talking about having these poetry jams, and what I'd been saying about like poetry being sort of seen as this very youth thing, I think there's some really interesting kind of like parallels across time and space. And as I think sometimes as medieval historians in particular, we're very keen to be like, no, it's not the same as the modern world. But actually, I think it's really important to also recognize where there are similar kind of threads that you can unravel that sort of give you that sad sense of understanding that there are certain aspects of being a young person or of a youth culture that have actually got that far longer history. And I don't know whether that helps young people to feel more connected or not. That's not for me to say. That would be for a question really to put to the people who work with you. Yeah.
I'm just trying to find this thing, and I don't know if I'll be able to find it, but it reminds me of, there was a really, I think it was YouGov did a poll, and they used this quote, which was like, young people are rude, don't respect their elders, and it was something else. And they basically posed that question to the public, and people had to vote, and lots of people were like, yeah, I strongly disagree with it. But basically the quote they'd used was a quote from Socrates. So it's from like I'm gonna get it wrong now. It's from BC, like ancient Greece. And they basically almost done it as a trick question to kind of go, well, here's this quote that's like 3,000 years old, and we've posed it to you in contemporary context, and you still agree, because in your head you think that the current young people are the most this, whereas you've actually responded to something that's 3,000 years old. And I think it's quite interesting. I thought it was a really clever way to kind of almost get people to reflect on how they perceive themselves and in their current time and their society around them, and how, I guess, we don't necessarily think about why their history or why their heritage and how we link to that. And actually, maybe there are these parallels we can really draw to the past, to the fact that 3,000 years ago, people were complaining about young people and making the exact same complaints that adults make about young people today. I thought it was really funny, really interesting.
Yeah, no, definitely, Lisa. And also, for some reason, it makes me think about this expression that I really don't like, that is often said to young people. I think it was said to me at one point. But, you know, young people are the future. You know, like, I get annoyed with that because sometimes it's like, yeah, but they're also the now. You know, they're also relevant now. They have opinions now. They need to be heard now. So I think, you know, I think especially in this day and age, like, and this is why adapting mindset definitions and how we use certain words is really important, because yes, they are similarities, but they are also potentially differences or developments in how young people see a certain thing. For example, obviously, you might see a young person now is very different from a young person 20 years ago before there were smartphones. You know, there is a difference in how they consume information and how they put out information as well. So I think, you know, I think with the heritage sector in particular, I think having that mindset of constantly adapting. I mean, I like to use the example of the dictionary. I mean, was it 2 words go in, 2 words go out every year? And that's, you know, words that are a bit more relevant and a bit more, not to say that words are forgotten forever, but language, for example, does change. So I think maybe not changing, but expanding this idea of heritage and young people and their kind of place in the world, which I do, obviously many organizations are changing, but I think expressions like that in the language they use can be very dangerous, because it implies that to young people, they are only valued in adulthood as opposed to now. But obviously it's wonderful with all the work you're doing, because that is kind of speaking back to that issue. But yeah, curious to what other people think.
Going off what you're saying as well. Now, this is gonna get kind of Sophie maybe, but when you were talking about how the quote of children, the youth are, you know, future, but actually no, they're here in the now, but also kind of reminding just the youth that they're allowed to make mistakes as well. I know this is kind of a little bit of a tangent, but every time I'm doing a workshop with a lot of young people, there's this, I don't know, maybe it's now it's a generalization. I feel like it's been across time, but there's this urge to be perfect and adult already. And actually, no, there's because it's okay to be silly and make your mistakes. It's part of the culture. And that's a very general statement, but it's make those mistakes, be silly. There is no rush. Big tangent, but I thought I'd mention that as well. Yeah.
I don't think half of the archive would exist if there weren't mistakes made by young people. We're sort of documenters of that in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah, I was just going to say, absolutely. I think half of the sources I come across, they're more, they focus more on the mistakes young people make, I think, and then you have to take that with a large pinch of salt, because who's judging that is a mistake or not, you know. But yeah, no, and Eugene, I love that idea that actually move away from this idea that youth is the future, because this is a theme that comes across so much in what I'm reading, is that the texts that are written by adults are very much trying to push children to become semi-adults. And what's often criticized about the Middle Ages and this idea that they didn't have a concept of adolescence and youth is this idea that everyone was just a mini adult. But actually that's what almost the modern world is still trying to do to young people. So again, that's another area of kind of crossover there between a period a long time ago, but actually still some of this kind of impetus to force people to become adults, and force them to perhaps only focus on what they could become rather than what they currently are and what they are already contributing and already are writing or doing or acting, or, you know, that's so much more important in that sense. So yeah.
I think that's really interesting, because it's not even just forcing someone to become an adult, but also forcing someone to become a certain type of adult that is the adult that we want to see, or that we think that is going to be a useful adult, with air quotation marks, and kind of pushing young people in that direction. I think a lot of times when we work with young people in the archive, or we talk to them about their experiences and what it's like being a young person, that kind of pressure is something that gets mentioned so often, where it's like, well, I'm expected to be a certain way and work towards something a certain way. And I forgot who was who mentioned phones and how that's changed how people interact, where young people, I did a workshop up in Birmingham recently actually with a school, and we were talking about perceptions of young people by adults, and they were all saying, it's so unfair because we're constantly getting told off for the fact that we use our phones and we have our phones, but we were born with them. It was the adults who were criticizing us who literally invented them and created the technology that I use today. So I'm being criticized for using the technology that they made in the first place. So it's like, it doesn't, like, what am I supposed to do? And that interesting dialogue, again, the pressures that we make and the pathways that we create and the expectations that we create, that actually, when you think about them a little bit more and unpick them a bit, they quite often don't make any sense. I mean, I think this has been a really interesting discussion, and I know that we've been going for about 2 hours now, all in. So I'm going to round it off here. I just wanted to just say at the end, before we kind of close off, is there anything anyone wanted to add as well, or any thoughts that have come up still?
Just thank you for inviting us, I think.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining this evening. I think it was such an interesting discussion, and I really I looked at the lineup and I was like, this might come across as quite a strange combination of people, but I think it was the perfect mix of different experiences and different approaches. So yeah, thank you all so much. What I'm going to do as well is in the comments section, I will add links to kind of all of your works and profiles, so if people do want to follow up with you and your work, they can do that in the comment section. But yeah, thank you so much for joining this evening. And also a massive thank you to the National Lottery Heritage Fund and lottery players for allowing us to help make it happen. But yeah, have a lovely evening, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
See you guys
Thanks
later.
so much, everyone.
Thanks.